You hear it all the time. England's schools are at a breaking point. But what's really going on behind all the headlines about funding promises and policy changes? Well, today we're going to dig into the data and uncover the real story of a system that is under some serious pressure.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we're going to follow the money, because that always tells a story. Then, we'll see how that financial pressure is affecting both the students and the teachers. And finally, we'll look at the big policy ideas that are supposed to be fixing everything. Let's dive in.
You know, if you really want to get to the heart of the challenges in education today, you have to start with the budget. It pretty much sets the stage for everything else that happens.
So at first glance, the news seems pretty positive. The government has announced these new, higher minimum funding levels for every student. And you look at the numbers for primary and secondary and you think, okay, that's a step in the right direction.
But, and this is a huge but, when you really look closer, that big increase kind of disappears. Analysts dug into the numbers and found that old grants were just rolled into the new core funding. So the actual increase in new money, it's practically zero.
And here's why that matters so much. When you factor in the rising costs of absolutely everything, from heating the building to buying supplies, that tiny increase actually becomes a pretty significant budget cut in real terms. The schools with the tightest budgets are going to feel that squeeze the most.
Okay, so we've talked about the money, but how does that funding squeeze, along with all the other pressures, actually trickle down and affect the students themselves? Let's take a look.
Well, one of the most obvious places you see this is in what's called the attainment gap. And this chart says it all. You can see right here in the national multiplication tests, there is a clear, persistent gap between the average scores of disadvantaged kids and their classmates.
And you know, this disparity isn't just about academics. When you look at school discipline, the data is even more stark. Pupils who get support for special educational needs, or SEN, are suspended at a rate more than 4 times higher than students without any identified needs. 4 times.
Now, the overall suspension rate has dipped a little bit, which is good, but the numbers are still way higher than they were before the pandemic. The number one reason given? Persistent disruptive behavior. And here's another shocking stat. Kids on free school meals are almost 4 times more likely to be suspended.
But all these numbers, they're really just symptoms of a much deeper issue. We're talking about something called social, emotional, and mental health needs, or SEMH for short. You can think of these as the absolute building blocks for learning, the skills a kid needs to manage their feelings, get along with others, and actually be able to focus in a classroom.
And honestly, the scale of this challenge is just staggering. A recent analysis found that nearly half of all students now need some level of SMH support. And what's really alarming is that the number of pupils with high needs has shot up by over 50% since just 2018.
All right, so we've seen the impact on students. But what about the people holding this whole system together? Let's talk about the human cost for teachers in a system under this much strain.
I mean, you really can't put it any plainer than this. The latest Teacher Wellbeing Index from the charity Education Support, well, they don't mince words. They use the word crisis to describe what's happening, saying well-being has hit a 5-year low.
And to see just how bad it is, look at this comparison. There's a huge gap between the well-being score for education staff and the general population. That's not a small difference. That's a chasm, and it shows just how much teachers are struggling compared to everyone else. So, what is pushing teachers to the brink? What's making them think about quitting? Well, the answer couldn't be clearer. For a whopping 2/3 of them, it all comes down to one thing: the sheer, overwhelming volume of their workload.
And we're not just talking about marking papers. Teachers are increasingly becoming a last line of defense against child poverty. We're talking about nearly half of them providing support every single week, giving out food, finding clothes. And while that's vital work, it takes a massive toll. Almost half the staff doing it say it's having a negative impact on their own mental health.
And this pressure cooker environment is having a devastating effect on leadership too. Get this, new data shows that nearly 1/3 of primary school head teachers under 50 who were just appointed 5 years ago have already left the job.
Okay, so the system is clearly facing a perfect storm of challenges. What's the response? What are the big policy ideas being put in place to try and adapt and fix all this?
Well, one of the biggest moves is happening at Ofsted, the school inspectorate. The new chief inspector has promised a fundamental shift, getting away from those high-stakes, anxiety-inducing inspections and moving towards something that's supposed to feel more like a collaborative dialogue with school leaders. Which, of course, leads to the big question, right?
Is a change in tone, a friendlier approach, really enough to fix the deep-seated, fundamental pressures we've been talking about?
And some of the early feedback suggests maybe not. One head teacher shared their experience and pointed out a big concern. Inspectors still wanted to see 3 years of strong results, and that can really penalize a new leader who's come in and made rapid improvements at a struggling school.
There's also a major push to tackle the crisis around supporting students with special educational needs. The government is basically acknowledging that 2/3 of training providers feel new teachers just aren't prepared for the reality of today's classrooms. So the plan is to beef up that initial training and to fund research into tools that can help identify and support kids much earlier.
And alongside those big reforms, a bunch of other initiatives are being rolled out to try and ease the pressure. We're seeing things like expanding free breakfast clubs to fight poverty, offering grants for new school-based nurseries, and even putting solar panels on schools to help with those crippling energy bills. Each one is a small piece of a much, much bigger puzzle.
So that's where we are. We've seen the data, we've heard the stories. England's schools are stretched to their absolute limits. And it leaves us with this one massive question. With funding so tight and staff at a breaking point, can these policy shifts, no matter how well-intentioned, really be enough to build a system that truly supports every child and every teacher? The future of a generation really does depend on the answer.